Stax. Possibly no other word in the Commander lexicon is more divisive within the community. It conjures images of prison decks where players are locked out of playing or interacting in any meaningful way. Being locked down under stasis, having lands frozen by a winter orb, or having the original Vorniclex stomping around across the battlefield. It brings grim reminders of games which drag out for hours with no meaningful progress on the board. The oppression of draw, discard to hand size, pass the turn, check your cell phone. So how does Stax still see so much play in cEDH? And is there any hope for it at more casual tables? Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. I'm John, and today we have another lesson from cEDH. cEDH is a metagame within the Commander format that sits at one extreme with highly consistent, highly efficient decks. Not all cards are equally powerful in all formats, or even in all metagames, but there are lessons to be learned from how people are brewing with the most powerful cards available. While Stax decks get a bit of a bad rap at casual tables, they have seen something of a renaissance in cEDH following the banning of Flash. cEDH Stax decks often attack the metagame from a particular angle, and the skills and nuances which skilled Stax players bring are the lessons that we are going to try to learn today. Fundamentally, Stax is a preemptive answer to an opponent's game plan. Rather than waiting until they cast a spell, you cast a permanent which prevents them from fully utilizing that spell they were going to rely on later during the course of the game. Stax makes the quality of cards opponents have in hand, and which they draw later, much lower than they would be otherwise. They are basically on-board tricks which can stop opponents dead in their tracks. Stax decks work in two different ways. First, there are hard stacks, which set a rule which prevents players from taking normally allotted game actions, or removes choices the player might otherwise have. Stasis causes players to skip their untap step, while Blood Moon prevents players from accessing colored mana from non-basic lands, and Chalice of the Void prevents players from being able to cast spells of a particular mana value. On the other side of the coin, we have soft stacks, which impose a new choice that players have to make between potentially detrimental effects. The namesake of the archetype, Smokestacks for example, is a soft stacks effect, which forces players to choose which permanents they have in play which they want to keep, and which ones they can afford to sacrifice. Smothering Tide lets you either pay for each card you draw or allow the enchantment's controller to create a treasure, and Winter Orb lets you either not tap lands for mana, or have access to fewer pieces of mana on the following turn. Stacks can also impact upon multiple different axes, attacking opponents' resources in multiple different ways. In cEDH, the gold standard of stacks is spells per turn, and the defining card for this is Rule of Law. Rule of Law sets a limit on how many spells a player can cast each turn, forcing them to prioritize which spells are the most important for them at any given time, a sort of soft stacks effect. But it also acts as a bit of a hard stacks piece against being able to cast a spell and protect it with counter magic, for example, or following it up with another card to form an A plus B combo, or casting one of the cards just drawn off a spell which refills a player's hand. Similar to Rule of Law, you have effects like Deafening Silence and Archon of Emeria, both of which set limits on how many spells a player can cast each turn. Similar to this are tax effects, which increase the cost to cast spells. Thalia, Garden of Thraben, Vryn Wingmare, and Grand Arbiter Augustin IV all potentially increase the cost of spells that opponents may wish to cast. You can also try to limit access to the cards players have available, such as with Notion Thief, Narset Parter of Veils, or Spirit of the Labyrinth, which limit players to a certain number of cards which they can draw each turn. You can also similarly limit their ability to tutor, with cards like Aven Mind Sensor, Opposition Agent, or even something like Grafdigger's Cage, which hits into play tutors as well as affecting graveyard strategies. Speaking of graveyard strategies, there are a number of different cards which deny players access to their graveyards. Cards like Rest in Peace, Ground Seal, and Ashiok Dream Render. Stacks can also make it hard to maintain creature-based strategies on the field. Grave Pact forces regular sacrifices, while Humility turns off the text boxes for creatures. Linvala, Keeper of Silence, and Cursed Totem both turn off activated abilities on creatures, including effectively being Humility against mana dorks. Stacks can also really hurt artifact-based strategies. Null Rod, Collector Oof, and Stony Silence just turn off artifacts altogether, while cards like Kataki War's Wage puts an upkeep cost on artifacts, often making them prohibitively expensive to keep in play. Kismet effects are a personal favorite of mine, which disproportionately slow down the faster decks at the table. Root Maze forces both artifacts and lands to enter the battlefield tapped, while Blind Obedience does the same for creatures and artifacts, while also having a bit of a win condition in the form of the Extort trigger. Now that we have a bird's eye view of what Stax can potentially look like in a game of Magic the Gathering, what does Stax look like in cEDH in particular? As I mentioned, Rule of Law is the go-to. It is the primary piece of Stax at most tables in cEDH. And why is that? As we mentioned, it stops many A+B win conditions, particularly Thassa's Oracle plus Demonic Consultation. It also makes Ad Nauseam much worse, because once you have refilled your hand with an Ad Nauseam, you can't really cast any other spells at that point, and you're just down to discarding the hand size, removing much of the power that Ad Nauseam has in a metagame full of broken mana rocks. And finally, it is almost impossible to Underworld Breach successfully through a Rule of Law effect. Kenrith Stax, for example, is a deck built primarily around Rule of Law, with a few other powerful effects thrown in to help keep the game on lockdown while you execute your primary game plan. Predatory Stax, as I mentioned before, like Opposition Agent, does see frequent play in cEDH as well, less so much to be able to turn off tutors, and more to occasionally get an opponent so you can steal their tutor from them at instant speed. Tax effects still see some play as well. They have some similarity to Rule of Law, but they are even softer, as opponents who can muster the mana can just cast through these. While Mana Denial is strong at some tables, and Blood Moon can absolutely punish some greedy mana bases, the existence of Dockside Extortionist has almost completely invalidated the card of Blood Moon in cEDH. Having access to red mana means that one Dockside allows a player to gain access to all colors of mana immediately, and often go for it without other players having any chance to use the mana they need to interact with that player's attempt to win. So there are a few lessons that we can take away from cEDH on how to use our Stax effects responsibly in games of casual Commander. First, the optimal approach to using Stax is to pick a key category of Stax and lean into it. Focus on the category of Stax, the axis of your opponent's game plans which you will attack. You want to have multiple redundant effects, so you are more likely to have access to your Stax pieces before your opponents can execute on their game plans. Just throwing every Stax card from multiple different categories and hoping to draw the one you need at any given time is really unlikely to work well. And it also means that opponents can simply remove the lone piece of Stax that stands in the way of them going for it, while leaving everyone else at the table too hampered to stop. Kenrith leans into Rule of Law with a few tutor denial effects like Opposition Agent to deny opponents their most common win conditions, limit their development, and also lean on them to stop them from being able to tutor out an answer for the soft lock. Second, you need to have a way to break parity on the Stax effects that you're playing. In Kenrith, you can lean into the 5 activated abilities that Kenrith has printed on his card to act as a mana sink, developing your game plan while opponents are limited to only a single spell each turn because of your Rule of Law effects. If you have no good way to play around your own Stax effects, all you have done is slow down the game without progressing your own plan. Failing to have a way around a hard Stax lock in particular is fairly egregious, and will not earn you many invitations to play that deck again. Third, layering Stax is difficult, and having multiple redundant Stax pieces on the battlefield is usually reserved for very specific occasions. It's usually much better use of resources to have a single Stax piece from a given category in play at a time to avoid being blown out by a card which can answer multiple of your Stax pieces at once. Using cards in hand to protect your lone Rule of Law means you can always follow it up with a Deafening Silence on your next turn if the Rule of Law does get removed. There are certain cases where you want to have multiple layers of Stax in play. A Rule of Law to stop the deck with the A+B win condition, as well as a Hushbringer or a Torpor Orb to stop somebody from being able to go for it with Dockside Extortionist, is an example of layering different types of Stax in order to leverage different effects. Next, and probably most importantly, you really want to make sure you have a way to win through your Stax, not just play around it, but to be able to win with it in a timely manner. The game has to end. And if you're choosing to build with Stax, you have a responsibility to bring the game to an end with a reasonable clock. Kenrith is usually the biggest body on the board in most cases in cEDH, and you can dump spare green mana into one of his abilities to pump him up with counters, as well as to give him trample for a red mana in order to win through Voltron damage if needed. Another prominent cEDH Stax deck, Winota, uses a masked board state to quickly overrun opponents who are slowed down by various Staxy creatures, who Winota can break Parity on with her attack trigger. Razakats is another deck in cEDH which can often lean heavily into creature-based stacks, because when they are going for the win, Razakat the Foul-Blooded can happily remove those for you, as fuel for the tutors he also provides. Your stacks should protect your win condition. If your opponents are playing to win, they should absolutely make any and every attempt they can to counter your win attempts, which potentially prolongs the stacks-filled game. As an unofficial bonus lesson, having other decks to play is a good way to keep things fresh, and helps prevent others in your playgroup from burning out on playing against stacks. Now, let's flip things on its head, and for the most important part of this lesson, we're going to discuss how to beat stacks. The greatest weakness of stacks decks is that there are often multiple ways that you can beat them. The most basic, but arguably the most important thing you can do, is to play more interaction. Spells which can remove both artifacts and enchantments are very good for this, as are cards which can remove non-land permanents. These are likely the best choice you can have if your playgroup features a regular stacks presence. Keep your interaction ready and available for when the time comes to remove a particular stacks piece, something we're going to discuss in more detail in a few moments. Your goal when playing against a stacks deck is to identify which game plans they are going to be attacking, and then trying to identify who at the table is being hurt the most by the stacks effects being put into play. Rule of Law stops A plus B combos and slows most fast decks down significantly. So if you are on a slower, more value-oriented game plan, you may be just fine stopping the Spellslinger deck or the Enchantress deck, decks which will often be drawing multiple cards and casting multiple spells each turn. Effects which lock down lands like Winter Orb are great against green land ramp strategies, and you may be well positioned if you are on an artifact-based strategy and have lots of mana rocks to ramp out with, while the landfall deck is being heavily slowed in development by Winter Orb. Remember, you have 3 opponents, but each of those opponents has 3 opponents as well. Use your opponent's stacks against your other opponents. Threat assessment is the key to go a step beyond how does that piece of stacks hurt me, and to understand how does this stacks piece hurt my other opponents. Use the time under stacks to develop your board and your hand. Consider this a prolonged, all-set-up stage of the game. With your other opponents hampered, you have a bit more freedom to develop, as usually only the stacks player themselves can play totally normally under the stacks effects they have brought to the table. And when you go to remove stacks pieces, use a scalpel. You may be removing a stacks piece that is stopping one or more of your opponents from going for it. Wait until the moment when you need to remove the stacks piece to act. Remove what is necessary, leave what you can in place in order to hamper your opponents. I've listed a lot of the most common stacks pieces in the format in the course of this episode. A really good exercise is to consider how these will impact the game plan of different decks that you play. I'll go back to good old-fashioned Scrappy Cat, my God Eternal Oketra Scrap Trawler deck as an example. Right up until I'm going for it, Rule of Law doesn't really stop me from playing the 1 creature per turn I want in order to get a free 4/4 zombie creature token in the process. By leaning heavily on artifact mana and basic planes for most of my mana sources, Blood Moon and Back to Basics do very little to hurt me, but Stony Silence and Null Rod are both potentially brutal for my game plan. Tokens and reusable creatures make Grave Pack effects much less detrimental to my deck than they might be to other decks at the table, but a Graveyard Denial effect to stop the basic value engine of the deck, as well as almost completely stopping me from being able to go for it, these are more troublesome. That said, I can often tolerate some Graveyard Denial effects, particularly if they are softer in the form of something like a Ground Seal, because I can often wait to remove those until I am ready to go for it. Taking a look at my cEDH Malcolm Kedis Polyhorn deck next, it's pretty flexible in which stacks pieces it can play around. Polymorph as the spell needed to go for it with Glinthorn Buccaneer is the one spell needed to cast the Rule of Law, and it doesn't search the library, so neither Opposition Agent nor Aven Mind Sensor will stop it. Some of the most commonly played stacks effects in cEDH have no effect on the game plan of Malcolm Kedis. But anti-artifact Stax pieces, like Collector Oof, are much more problematic, since these stop Malcolm and Kedis from amassing mana advantage, and prevent the deck from being able to combo off with Malcolm and Glinthorn. On the other hand, tax effects like Grand Arbiter Augustin IV and Thalia may slow the deck down, but the deck has access to so much ramp that these taxes often slow opponents down much, much more, making these often much more harmful to opponents than they are to Malcolm Kedis. So in closing, Stax is often misunderstood as a game plan. In spite of its reputation, when used correctly, Stax can make games much more memorable and enjoyable for everyone involved, with lots of interaction and plenty of time to develop interesting board states. Rule Zero talks are the perfect time to discuss Stax decks being included in a game. Use it as an opportunity to identify the type of Stax the deck might be leaning on most heavily. Remember that a deck with a small number of Stax pieces, such as a single Spirit of the Labyrinth or Aven Mind Sensor in a mono-white deck, these do not necessarily qualify as true quote-unquote Stax decks. There is often a fine line between what constitutes a true lockdown Stax deck and a more mid-range deck simply trying to slow opponents down by a half step in order to allow their value engine to take over. Feel free to ask the Stax player what their win condition is as well, reinforcing that it is important for them to be able to bring the game to an end, particularly if their primary game plan is to lock the board down hard under a powerful Stax lock. I don't think that it's right to have a blanket no Stax ever rule in your playgroup though. The Rules Committee has done a very good job of banning the most egregious Stax pieces, particularly Stax pieces in the command zone, so they are no longer available in the format. You're not going to run into Leovold or Braids in any game of Commander, so you don't have to worry about the most powerful Stax effects available in the game coming out of the command zone. Playing around Stax pieces can also be a great puzzle to solve, and can test your deck and gameplay skills in a way that no other archetype really can. Remember too that it's on the Stax player to make sure that they Stax responsibly. Someone who simply layers multiple Stax effects with no real way to win through it, well, that's on them and they do need to improve their deck. But someone who's playing in good faith into your particular metagame with a Stax deck, that player should have a seat at the table as well. As an alternative to maintaining an alternate ban list which bans all Stax effects from your game, you may consider limiting it to one Stax effects per game session instead. This way, it gives the person with a Stax deck a chance to play it once in a while, instead of essentially saying that their deck is not welcome at your table. But we want to hear from you. Do you have any other lessons you've taken away from playing with or against Stax decks? Leave us a comment on YouTube, add us on Twitter, where we are GemstoneMineMTG, or send us an email, where we are gemstoneminepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mine.